Hey guys, welcome to Platitude US History. For some of you, this may be your very first one. And today I am going to talk about creating Anglo-American, Anglo-American colonies and the colonial period. And we've been talking about that. We've talked about the Puritans, but I kind of wanted to put everything all together. So what's crazy about the colonies is that at some point they made the shift from being purely English to being Anglo-American. Now this seems barely discernible, but it is something that you need to recognize because events occurred that changed the perspective of those that settled the area from an Anglo-centric view to that of a unique blend of old world and new. There were issues in the New World that experiences gained in the Old World could not have prepared them for. So at the outset, the settlers faced very, very bad odds of survival. They arrived most times sick, exhausted, they just experienced a long sea journey, and the supplies they brought were barely enough to last their first few months. A few months. And they walked into a world that they had no idea how to cultivate. So their hopes for profitable trade would take years, if not decades, to realize. And their unfamiliarity with the New World environment placed them at an immediate, across-the-boards disadvantage. It was insane. So that right there, that alone is going to shift their mindset. Nearly everything they encountered was weird. Most of them had no prior experience with wooded landscape because they had cut down all their trees back in England. So most of the forests in their homeland had disappeared. So that wilderness, that American wilderness, was very menacing to them. It was scary. Remember when we talked about the Puritans, we said the wilderness, the forest, the trees, that was evil. And mostly because it was unknown and scary and dark, and there were things that they didn't understand in there. But it wasn't just the American wilderness that was a shock to them. They were not very familiar with human difference. Let's be real. They came from a pretty homogenous society, and then they encountered diversity. And that alone usually tends to change a person's view of the world. When they are traditionally exposed to just one type of person and then thrown into a world with a whole bunch of different people, and this is a thing that is still real today for you and me and whatever. But it was a whole new experience for them. They were encountering people of different races, different cultures, different languages, and it was heavy for them. So basically, the new experience of this, they started to supplant the original population and culture with their own. This will, consciously or not, change the outlook of the average colonist. Uneasy alliances were made, but were often broken as colonial numbers grew and pushed westward into earlier agreed-upon native lands. So the natives and the colonists sort of got along, but neither respected the other. It was the craziest thing. So Native Americans were seen by different groups through the lens of what they represented. To merchants, natives were a consumer base, an untapped market. Woohoo! A place where they could sell goods and make a tidy profit. To governments, natives were allies used to fight colonial battles and wars. To farmers and planters, well, natives were just an obstacle. Right? But that's an oversimplification. It's a simplistic view. And it kind of makes the colonists out to be the bad guys and the natives the victims. And by no means am I saying they weren't victims of European and American forces. What I am saying is the story is more complicated than that. So without realizing it, colonists were as much pawns in a game of dominance being played by the bigger native factions and alliances as the native populations themselves were pawns in the European battles for influence in the New World. The colonists sought to overcome the unnerving strangeness of this land by remaking it in the image of home. So they tried to anglicize so many things. They sought to replicate English ways. And all of this was part of convincing themselves that they had not lost, that essential part of themselves, that patriotism, that tie to the motherland, that core of English. And that denial or delusion, for the most part, it worked. It helped them. But let's be clear, not everything the colonists did exactly represented English ways. I mean, it couldn't. Just think about what we've already talked about. Especially in the early settlement process, every man, woman, and child was needed to develop the wilderness into livable conditions. They had to create economies that were viable for consumption and trade. They had to retrofit the rights of Englishmen and the Magna Carta into some semblance of governance so that it didn't turn into some anarchical, I don't know if that's a word, version of government, if that's even a thing. I think that's an oxymoron, anarchy and government together. So these experiences in themselves naturally encourage liberties that many had never experienced on English soil. Women in particular were given rights early on, let's be clear, early on. By 1750, things had pretty much settled into traditional gender roles. But early on in the settlement process, women had liberties that they did not have in England. And I think that really encouraged the idea of, it kind of kept that idea in the back burner of many women's minds that, women's roles don't have to be just about the home and the family. They can own businesses and they can be prosperous widows. Let's be clear, they have to be widows. They have to have been married, and it didn't matter where you were in the colonies. If you were a woman and you were unmarried and you tried to engage in commerce, you would be shut down. So, there is that. But like I said, by the 1750s, that had pretty much evened out into traditional gender roles, reverting women back into the home. In fact, throughout the year, we'll talk about the role of women in various eras, and it's always a back and forth. Inside the home, outside the home, inside the home, outside the home. Just keep your eye out for it as we talk. Unfortunately, let's go back to how everyone was working towards this betterment, right? But unfortunately, the original settlers will prove to need more labor than originally imagined. So there was a serious labor shortage. In the Chesapeake region, the main response during the first several decades was indentured servitude. In short, the contracting of mostly indigent young men and women to work for a particular master for a set amount of time, usually 7 years, after which he or she would be free. And usually there was some kind of payment at the end of it, like you would get some land or you would get a donkey or some other, beast of burden to help you plow your own land. Oftentimes those promises were broken, however, so keep that in mind. In the Carolinas, the response would be slavery. Obviously not at first, but Carolina was started as an offshoot of the Barbados where slavery was really already a thing. So really, they just continued what they had already been doing for years. The New Netherlands in New York, a major response would be tenancy. Tenancy is like tenant farmers. They would lease land from larger owners who had, much larger farms, and they would work off that land and pay the owner of the land part of their harvest and keep the rest for themselves. Tenant farming is notorious for being a bad system to be the tenant. If you're the owner of the land, kudos. Your job is great. You don't have to do anything and you make all kinds of money. However, the tenant farmer has a very hard life. Pennsylvania and New Jersey, the response was a combination of tenancy and servitude, so they had both indentured servants and tenant farmers. New England was different. New England, I mean, we talked about them briefly, but to just kind of talk about how they dealt with labor shortage, they didn't really have a labor shortage because they had a different type of economy. And I'll talk about colonial economies in another video. I mean, they did have some family farms, but basically it was just around farming enough food for your family, and they chose a different route. So they didn't really need any form of bound labor. They didn't need slaves. They didn't need indentured servants, and they didn't need tenant farmers. Instead, they did the work themselves, and each household made full use of its own members, especially grown sons. Sometimes grown sons would be prevented from marrying much longer than was normal because the father still needed them to work the father's farm, as opposed to go off and be free and get their own farm and family. Distance and difficulties threw most of the government founding plans off track. Within a generation or two, effective governance had migrated along with the settlers themselves to scattered venues across the new continent. In Massachusetts and Virginia, and later in New York and Pennsylvania, homegrown legislative bodies sprang into being, and they assumed an increasing measure of control. So this process, like the heavy reliance on unfree labor, seemed to reverse prevailing trend lines in England. But let's be clear, decentralization and local autonomy did not mean democracy. Virtually everywhere, no matter what region you were in, power was held by the elites. This means that you had a small group of people, usually better educated, definitely wealthy. They were like the gentlemen in America. They're the ones that held political power. They're the ones that held the power in the courts. So they controlled a wide range of administrative and judicial affairs. Typically, these courts and public officials, they handled taxes, land titles, estate probates, welfare, militia, all kinds of things. Their system of town meeting government offered wider scope for population participation. Leaders were chosen annually by vote, and policy was decided the same way. Still, voting itself was limited to a certain portion of townspeople, and depending upon where you went, those qualifications differed. Sometimes, like we know in the Puritans in New England, it was church membership. Then it was you had to make a certain amount of money, so you had to pay a certain amount of taxes, therefore you gained the right to vote. Some people, you had to own a certain amount of land to gain the right to vote, 50 acres, 100 acres, whatever. And then it was just property ownership. At no point was it like universal man suffrage. I mean, you couldn't just be a person and go vote. That was not a thing. So, yeah. But here's the thing. Because of economic opportunities, the social credentials, those things that became important, they were achievable. They were viable. So you could start with nothing legitimately and work your way up to owning property or whatever, and suddenly you're like top dog and you're the guy who's making policy decisions. Whereas before, back in England, you had no family pedigree, so your life sucked. Okay? So leadership changed in the New World. Not how it was formed, not just how it was formed, but who was a part of it. So that's really cool. Unfortunately, as one century yielded to the next, colonial society attained a more solid and settled shape. The position of the leaders seemed increasingly secure, because that's what happens when you have a system based on spoils, which it was. So to the victor goes the spoils, and this spoil system, they would give out huge land grants to their friends, and they would take care of their family, and they would leave a lot of other families bereft, right, and without. And so when you do this over and over and over again, you definitely develop an economic caste system. So that's pretty significant. And so what happens is the common people, life had become safer, and they were more secure, but they had fewer freedoms. Unless, of course, you were on the frontier, right? So by the 1740s, the colonies had become 3 distinctly different regions with significantly different approaches to the various systems built in the century before. So in New England, types of settlers, very homogenous. You've got your English, a bunch of white people, like everyone's white, but they're like white. That was terribly racist. Okay, what I mean by that is that they were Puritans. They were all Puritans or Congregationalists. They were all English. They did not come from other countries, so they were from a very specific set of people. In the middle colonies, these are like New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania. In that area, you've got Quakers and Dutch and French and Germans and Scots-Irish and so many other people, and they're all speaking different languages. You know, it's very diverse in the middle colonies, so that's pretty awesome. In the southern colonies, you have diversity, and yet you don't. It's the weirdest thing. So you have that controlling elite. You have the English, the aristocrats, you have the planters, you have the small farmers, and all of those people are all pretty similar. They're usually members of the Anglican Church. They are usually English. They're not usually from a lot of other countries, and here's why: because the other diverse part of their population were African slaves, and the other countries, they did not move to the south because they could not compete with slave labor, so they moved to the middle colonies where it was easy to get land and freedoms. So technically the South was diverse because it had 2 distinctly different races commingling, and sometimes literally, right? Okay, so let's look at religious groups. Obviously, New England are Puritans, very strict, gloomy, superstitious, Salem witch trials, right? Middle colonies were all about tolerance. And like I said, the southern colonies were mostly Anglican, which means Church of England. There was Maryland as a haven to Catholics, but not for very long. Eventually, the Puritans will take over that, or not the Puritans, I'm sorry. The Protestants will take over that, and Catholics will lose a lot of rights that they had before. Role of women, you had large families in New England. In fact, that was one of the reasons why they developed so quickly, right, is because they came over with large families. They came over ready for town building and home building and community building, whereas in the South, you basically had a lot of young single men who were coming to make a lot of money quickly and then go back to England. They were usually 2nd, 3rd, 4th sons who didn't really have anything to keep them where they were or any kind of inheritance, so they had to make their own way, and they didn't want to join the military or join the church, so they decided to sow their wild oats in the Americas. Because of this, women were rare in the South, and their role was very sheltered. And that's if you were a highborn woman. If you weren't a highborn woman, usually you were not seen very well. But that doesn't mean that there weren't, different class of women. It's just, I'm not saying that you were either a lady or a prostitute, but those are the two images that usually arise when you think of women in the South, especially in the early days of settlement. Let's see. In the middle colonies, they had a great mix. They had some families, they had some single men trying to make their way. It was the middle colonies. When you think the middle colonies, you need to think diversity. And here's what's weird. The stark contrast and what most people look at are the North and the South, right? The New England colonies and the Southern colonies. And everyone's like, and the middle colonies, they were just kind of there. They weren't just kind of there. They were amazing. They were like this huge melting pot before we even used that term for the United States or Americas or the colonies or anything like that. And they were like the bridge between the two contrasting. It was like a spectrum. And it was very cool. Let's see, educational opportunities. Let's talk about that. In New England, schooling was for boys and girls. Everyone had to be able to read because everyone had to be able to read their Bible. See how that works? New England had the first university. They developed Harvard in 1636. Harvard's been around a while. Middle colonies, they had fewer schools in New England. They were usually started by religious groups. You had Princeton. It wasn't as important, but, excuse me, but it was more important than, say, in the South. And in the South, school was really not important at all. Wealthy sons were taught by tutors at first, and then eventually when the colonies were trying to anglicize again, because that meant that they were trying to be more English, they started to send their sons to England to go to English schools. And they developed, in the southern colonies, you have the College of William and Mary was developed. But yeah, public schooling, especially in the South, not a thing. So New England, definitely a thing. Everyone had to be able to learn how to read. Middle colonies, for some colonies it was a thing, for others it was not. It just depended on the priorities based around agriculture or commerce or what they were trying to do. And in the South, not a priority at all. Education, not a thing. Unless you were very, very wealthy and you did not have to work in the fields from the age of 4 and so on and so forth. So, types of local government. In New England, you've got town meetings. You had the ability to speak out, to vote. There was a high degree of self-government. In the middle colonies, again, it was a mix of both town meetings and county governments. And in the South, counties were a unit. They were led by justices of the peace and sheriffs, and they had an appointed governor. And these guys pretty much just ruled everything. So everyone else just kind of had to do what they said. So you have a mix of all kinds of things happening in these different regions. So what does this mean for you guys? So you're building this super colony with the best of the best, right? You need to think about the choices that you have made so far. Are they going to attract the people you want to attract? Because your goals have to everything that you build into your colony has to align with your goals so that it attracts the right people who will work towards those goals. Are you building a governing system that will satisfy geographic, economic, social, and population needs? These are all things that you need to think about. Because all of these things are connected. You need to make sure that your colony is cohesive, and it needs to have stuff from the original 13. Don't forget about that. All right. Good luck.